Hello, and welcome to Mental Health, the podcast where we discuss the latest tools, the cutting-edge research, the ancient practices to help you take back control of your emotional well-being.
I've never heard you say that line before. That's like totally my bit. It's like, it sounds so strange coming out of your mouth. I'm like, dude, that's like my role in this relationship is the podcast bit.
Yeah, what's so hilarious is it sounds great when you say it. And when I say it, I'm listening to myself and I'm like, oh my.
Do you know what it is though? It's kind of like the phone voice. I always say to people, like, it's the hardest part of a podcast is the intro and the outro because it's the one bit that feels so artificially constructed and fake. So, dude, I feel your pain. Don't worry. See, whenever we hit our 100th episode, you're going to be like coming in like a veteran radio presenter with this deep, bassy, smooth, charismatic way that you usually are in all of our conversations. So, yeah.
Welcome to Mental Health.
Exactly.
No, I don't know. So, listen, it's still early days, as you can tell, for the Mental Health Pod. This is just, believe it or not, our 6th episode. Hugh and I we're already brainstorming different ways to keep the content fresh, to keep our intros fresh, to keep everything from getting too predictable. And so that's the spirit in which we offer today's episode. We are thrilled to mix it up a lot today by presenting a remarkable interview that Hugh recently recorded with literally one of the world's leading addiction specialists, Dr. Anna Lembke.
Yeah, and I've shared this with Steve so many times, like, this was a interview of a lifetime for me. Like, I don't know if you remember, Steve, I sent you like a text on Signal whenever Anna said yes. I was like, oh my goodness, it's happened. She said yes. And I've never been as hyped for an interview before. Anna is just this remarkable academic. She's kind of sprung into superstardom here. She's doing the rounds on like all these big fancy podcasts. And so we're incredibly honored to have her on our show today. Really, really excited to share this content with you. It has made a huge impact and it's been so meaningful to me in my own life. And to be honest, I kind of do a big intro in the interview itself, so I'm not going to give too much more. It's all about dopamine. It's all about addiction, and kind of accidentally is going to set us up for some really, really interesting stuff that we plan to put out on the podcast over the next couple of weeks. But that's cart before the horse. We will come back at the end of the show to do a little bit of I don't know, what do we want to call it, Steve? A post-mortem? It's not really mental healthy, but it's kind of medically, isn't it?
We're going to give some of our reactions, our takes, but you know what? This is the moment where we just need to jump in. So let's go.
Let's go.
Anna, it's such an honor to be speaking with you today. Your work has made such a huge impact on my life personally ever since I read your new book, Dopamine Nation. And I'm so excited to have the chance to share some of your ideas and your research with our listeners today. So thank you.
Aw, thank you. That is so nice. It's been incredibly gratifying to hear from people like you and also readers around the world saying that the book has helped change some aspect of their life for the good. That's just incredibly rewarding for me. So thank you.
Awesome. So, look, I'd really love to make the most of our time together and get right into it, as it were. I have like an obnoxiously long list of questions, which we won't even remotely get to cover, but just to get us all on the same page. And it's probably a bit of an obvious place to start, but what actually is dopamine and what does it do to our brain?
Yeah, so dopamine is a brain, dopamine is oh boy, not off to a good start.
It's all good.
All right, so dopamine is a chemical that is made in our brain, and it's essential for the experience of reward, motivation, and pleasure. It's also very important to movement. For example, people who develop Parkinson's disease have a depletion of dopamine production in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And it's not a coincidence that dopamine is linked to both motivation, reward, and movement, because of course, for most of human existence, if we wanted to get that reward, we had to get up and go after it. Of course, that's all changed now, which is part of the problem.
And I think, sometimes in trying to understand what something is, the kind of absence of it or the opposite of it is also really interesting. And an example that kind of really freaked me out in your book was, I think it was a study about a mouse that they were somehow able to cut off all sources of dopamine to its brain. And they showed that the mouse actually chose to starve to death instead of going to get a bit of food, even though the piece of food was in its own cage. And when I read that, I was just like, whoa, that is so intense and such a great example of how powerful dopamine is for us, you know?
Yeah, that's one of these seminal experiments where these rats were engineered to have no dopamine, so no dopamine production, no dopamine receptors in the reward pathways. And as you say, when food was placed a mere body length away from the rat, it starved to death. It wasn't able or willing to get up and move toward the food. But interestingly, if food was placed directly in its mouth, it did chew the food, eat the food, and seem to get some, gustatory satisfaction from the food, which brings up an interesting point about dopamine, that it's probably more associated with motivation to get a reward than it is with the experience of pleasure itself. Although, of course, those things are intertwined.
This is maybe a little bit cart before the horse, but how connected is dopamine level in someone's brain to, say, a disorder like depression? Because again, just when you were talking about the rat there, I just thought about, the depressed individual who maybe doesn't want to get off the sofa, doesn't want to get out of bed to cook themselves, say, a healthy meal, but would maybe be okay with eating like a bag of chips or something like that instead because it's convenient, it doesn't require as much effort. Or am I completely off piece? I'm also... No,
it's a great question, and it's a question that scientists have asked. And there are data around this question, and I think one way to look at it is to consider the two extremes of mood. So there are data showing that people with depression may, in fact, have lower baseline levels of dopamine firing in their brains, especially in the frontal lobe areas. So that's quite interesting and sort of consistent with this overall hypothesis regarding dopamine's role in the brain. Also, when people become manic, for example, in bipolar disorder, so when the mood is abnormally elevated, often we will treat that condition with medications that block dopamine receptors and, in effect, decrease the dopamine transmission and dopamine firing. And those tend to work to bring people down from a euphoric manic state. So it is probable, based on, sort of inference, but also some data that people with dopamine, switching that around. People with depression, I've got dopamine on the brain. People with depression, have lower baseline levels, and people who are manic and euphoric have higher baseline levels, and that's independent of anything they ingest.
Wow.
It's sort of their own, brain doing its own thing.
Really interesting. So this all has kind of been groundwork to get to the crux of really what I want to talk about today. And this is your incredible metaphor and also your incredible finding that you fleshed out in your book, Dopamine Nation, about the seesaw. And I have to say, I'll caveat this before we go any further. This is something that I've shared with friends, with family, with anyone who will listen to me about the dopamine seesaw. And I have to say, it lands so well with people, and you see the light bulb switch on in the person's head whenever you share it. So yeah, I am a Anna Lembke dopamine disciple at this point. And so yeah, let's talk about the seesaw, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
One of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years or so is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So what that means is that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance or a seesaw, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. So imagine that in the part of your brain called the reward pathway, where pleasure and pain are processed, there is a literal seesaw. And when we experience pleasure, that tips one way, and when we experience pain, it tips the opposite way. But one of the overarching rules governing that balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. So if I, for example, eat something delicious to me, I get a little release of dopamine in my brain's reward pathway, and this balance tips slightly to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain will adapt to that increased dopamine by downregulating my own dopamine transmission and my own dopamine production. And I like to imagine that as these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But here's the thing about the gremlins, they really like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until it's tipped, till an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's that moment of wanting, one more potato chip or one more piece of chocolate or one more YouTube video or one more drink. Now, if we wait long enough, those gremlins eventually will hop off and balance is restored. But here's the other sort of central finding about this balance. With repeated exposure to the same or similar rewarding stimulus, that initial response to the side of pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but the after response to pain gets stronger and longer. In other words, if I then reach for a second piece of chocolate, I now get that original gremlin hopping on the pain side of my balance, plus 3 or 4 of her cousins, right? and then it tips harder. So that means, I then want a third piece of chocolate, even more than I wanted that second piece of chocolate. And this continues on in an iterative fashion until we end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. That is now entering the realm of the addicted brain, right? Because now what it is I'm walking around with a balance that's semi-permanently tilted to the side of pain. Now I need to use my drug of choice, in this case, eating chocolate, not to feel good, but just to bring the balance level and feel normal. My focus has now become very narrowed on obtaining chocolate and arranging my whole day around getting that chocolate. And importantly, when I'm not eating chocolate, I'm walking around with a balance tipped to the side of pain, and I'm experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance. That's anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of my drug and wanting to use it. And that is why people will relapse. So, when I initially came to this field, it was really a mystery to me. Why is it that people with severe addictions will relapse months after they've stopped using when it's so obvious that their lives are so much better? And they will even attest, my life is so much better now that I'm not using. And I finally realized it's because they're not walking around with a level balance. They're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain. Every day they're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. It's all they can do to make it through a day and not use.
And something I really love about your work and also some of the work that you included as part of your book, you have this unbelievable quote from, I think it was a guy called Kent Dungington, and he kind of had this quote that was something along the lines of, addicts are kind of like the prophets of our generation, and if we ignore them, we're going to miss out on some really key lessons. Because we are living in a dopamine nation, as you've kind of very succinctly put it. We are all so susceptible to addiction, probably more than ever. And actually, the recovery community has all of these kind of decades upon decades upon decades of wisdom and tried and tested kind of philosophies that need to become part of our everyday toolkit in order for us to survive. And just whenever you were saying, about why people relapse and how there's always that kind of threat. As a result of being exposed to your work, I've gone and I've read the AA Big Book, which is not something that I ever thought I would read. My addictions in the past were all digital orientated. So I was really addicted to pornography. I was addicted to video games. And I have to say, I just felt that the AA Big Book should be essential reading for every single human on the planet.
Yeah,
and they've got this great thing where they talk about, you're never more than 6 feet away from the ditch or something like that.
Yeah, right.
And I just find like that metaphor in itself, but also the wider AA philosophy, just to be so refreshing, so interesting.
How fascinating that you've come to the Big Book and AA philosophy like indirectly through, so quite a bit after, you've been in recovery from your digital addictions. That's really, really interesting to me. Yeah, the AA philosophy, first of all, Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the most remarkable social movements of the past 100 years. Here you have an entirely grassroots organization, totally free of any political or external influence, totally free of any kind of funding. And yet you have millions and millions of members all over the world. I mean, you can go to remote cities in China and probably find an AA meeting. It's really, really incredible. And, as you say, and as I sort of, the whole premise of my book, Dopamine Nation, is to sort of understand what's happening in the brain. So look at it all through, the lens of neuroscience, but also to really hold up people in recovery from severe addiction as modern day prophets for the rest of us, precisely because they have acquired this collective and individual wisdom over, now going on 100 years. And, the funny thing is that I learned about AA and recovery through my patients long before I myself developed any kind of compulsive overconsumption problem, which I talk about in the book. Mine is akin to pornography. It's, I became addicted to romance novels and then ultimately sort of hardcore erotica. And the Kindle was one of the major sort of mediating factors for me when it was easily downloadable digital versions. But even before I developed, my particular addiction, I was always in admiration of the AA philosophy and the movement of recovery and the wisdom therein. And a lot of people, I think, who work in addiction medicine, even if they themselves are not in recovery, they're drawn to the field because of much of the AA philosophy and also, just the spirit of recovery, the spirituality, all of the many important lessons therein, which apply, I think, to all of us living in the modern world, whether or not we self-identify as having an addiction.
Yeah, and what I love about what you shared in the book about your own addiction was that, the method of delivery matters. So if you think historically of something like alcohol, you needed easy access to some form of alcohol in order to become addicted to it. And throughout history, we've done a relatively okay job at protecting this from kids until a certain age, though obviously not in every situation. And what is different about today, we have a little daughter, she's a year and a half, so we're far away from the storms, as it were, of parenting. But even at this early stage, we're trying to be really mindful of how can we protect our kids from this digital world, because the technology itself is actually super addictive. Like, never mind the drug, the quote unquote drug that it delivers, whether it's a book or whether it's pornography or whether it's a video game, but you see it in kids. They love screens. They don't care what's on the screen. They love tapping the buttons. They love the feedback it gives us. And so I just find it super interesting that, the digital device itself is addictive before you add any sort of drug through the quote unquote needle. And another metaphor I loved in your book that you shared was this idea of a cacti in a rainforest, where, we're so used to, throughout history, the scarcity of dopamine, the scarcity of addictive substances. And now, from everything to the food that we eat, the entertainment we engage in, every facet of our lives is just a constant drowning of dopamine. And I suppose I'd love to talk a little bit about addictions like pornography, addictions like video games, addictions like erotic fiction, because my impression is, as someone who's been in recovery of this for about 8 years, it is seen differently, or it's only been in recent years that these kind of quote unquote less severe addictions have been started to be accepted by the wider recovery community, because it's not an actual substance or there isn't a clear drug that people are being hooked on. So could you just explain to us, why can we in theory become addicted to anything?
The wiring in our brain has evolved over millions of years of evolution and is highly conserved across species. And it's this reward pathway, this pleasure-pain balance, which has evolved precisely to keep us alive. We are wired to approach pleasure and avoid pain. We have an incredible hippocampal tattoo that is a memory for these experiences that give us pleasure, and this kind of paradoxical amnesia in many ways for the the pain that comes from pleasure, as well as the way that pain itself can lead to pleasure. So we have this very strange, conflicted relationship in terms of our memory, and yet we have this incredible drive to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And for that reason, in the modern ecosystem, where everything has become drugified and everything is reinforcing and easily accessible, and access is one of the most important risk factors for becoming addicted. And that's one of the things I really emphasize in the book. Because of that, we've all become vulnerable to the problem of addiction. And I would just really want to echo what you say about the technology. You know, part of the danger here is that it gives us easier access to traditional drugs. It delivers drugs that didn't exist before, like video games. But precisely as you say, it is the screens and the devices themselves that actually have an organic or lifelike quality that keep pulling us back. I think it can feel very much like tending to a plant or tending to a small child. These things kind of command our attention and are really designed to sort of hijack those motivational reward systems in ways that occur, you know, quite outside of our own consciousness.
It's really funny. You kind of refer to it as, you know, tending to a plant. I remember one of the first big kind of games that swept across our kind of local community was whenever Facebook was just kind of getting off the ground. There was this game called Farmville, and it was a time-based game where you would plant, like, I don't know, strawberries or something, and you'd have to check back maybe an hour later to make sure that they'd grown okay. And I just remember, like, just being blown away that, like, everyone I knew was on this game, and it was the strangest game ever. Like, there was no reward to it. Like, you know, you were just growing these virtual plants, and even at that stage, I think I was like 13. I was like, what is going on? Like, you know, like grown ass people that I know got really into this game, and I was like, I thought like it was just like teenagers that got addicted to this stuff. Which is super funny.
Right. Yeah, even at 13, you had sort of the intuition to realize it was crazy.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know. Again, back to the AA Big Book. One of the most refreshing things about it for me was just the honesty that people have about how they trick themselves. You know, they do the strangest things to almost have that first drink again. There was the example that springs to mind. There was a guy who was in a diner one day and he was drinking a glass of milk and he thought, hey, what would happen if I put a little bit of whiskey in this milk? You know, and he's like, I'll not get drunk. Like, it's just one shot of whiskey and milk. And he does that. And then he's like, oh, that didn't affect me. I'll take another one. And then next thing you know, he's on like a 10-day bender in New York or something like that. But in the first lockdown, and again, you would think I would have seen this coming particularly with my video game addiction, because I've moved away from all that stuff. You know, I don't own a console. I'm not engaged in any video game actively. But I got really into chess. It was at the time the Queen's Gambit came out on Netflix. And I was stuck in Germany for 4 months. And I was like, oh, you know, I enjoyed chess. I played it with my granny when I was a kid. And so, you know, I hopped on like this online chess app and started playing it with my friends. And honestly, like 1 month later, I had to have a really serious conversation with myself where I was like, oh my goodness, how have you been blindsided by this thing? You're playing a video game. Like, sure, it's a classic ancient board game, but you know, I was playing like 1 minute rounds of speed chess and I was doing it like, you know, 30 times in an hour. And I was like, oh, Matthew, like, what? I can't believe like we're here yet again. But again, it's back to this point where the technology, you know, the issue for me wasn't chess itself, and chess is a great example. You know, let's romanticize it. You know, it's a sunny day, you're in Central Park, you know, you're outside connecting with another human being, and that kind of gets twisted and morphed into this digital matrix version of it where you're just constantly looking for the dopamine. And what you said about the pain and pleasure balance totally rings true in this example, because, you know, I started off playing 60-minute games and then it got lowered to 30 minutes because it was more exciting, and then 10 minutes and then 5 minutes. And then next thing you know, you're just playing blitz chess because it's the fastest way to get that drug into your brain, which is, it's funny, but that's just the way it is. And what I love so much about your work and some of your colleagues, even Andrew Huberman, I'm a big fan of, is kind of this idea that, you know, modern science seems to be catching up with or proving ancient philosophy and wisdom. I don't know who it was, but I remember reading it again at a young age, at maybe 16. Was it Socrates? It was Plato, somebody like that, where he literally said the pursuit of pleasure is the pursuit of pain.
Yeah, right.
And here we are hearing about the seesaw, and you're like, oh my goodness, on a neuroscientific level, this dude was right. How crazy.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that was Socrates as recorded by Plato, who talked about on the heels of every pleasure there is pain, and on the heels of pain there's pleasure. And now we have neuroscience to show that it's true, and that's always fascinating when our sort of reductionistic way of describing the world turns out to really add not much more than people have already known or figured out for 2,000 years. But it's fascinating. So I think your chess example brings up two really important themes. The first is the ways in which we can rationalize addictive behavior because of, what I'll say is a class experience, meaning that if it's sort of a highbrow version of whatever that activity is, we say to ourselves, well, that's not an addiction because, I'm doing X, I'm playing chess, and chess is for intellectuals. Or for example, people who gamble by, buying Bitcoin or trading like these, whatever these kinds of very risky stocks are, and they do it on Robinhood. They say, well, I'm investing. I'm not gambling, I'm investing. Or even in my case, I was reading. Oh, I'm reading. Reading is, that's what smart people do. I'm not watching porn or watching whatever. But of course, what I was reading was just the equivalent of candy. So I think that's one important thing, the ways in which we kind of can very easily rationalize that. And we do it in this, I'm sort of like, oh, this is a good version of this, or this is, The other thing, though, I think, which is really important is the way in which it becomes a group phenomenon. And chess is, again, another great example. So now we have something that really exploded during quarantine. It didn't exist before. Is, these chess champions who basically have a live stream where they're also interacting with fans in real time, responding to the commentary. And it's highly entertaining, and they're playing chess at the same time. So now you've made the whole chess experience more rewarding by making it a communal social experience involving, not tens of people or hundreds of people, millions of followers, right? Who are all collectively, talking with each other, talking with, who's the guy, the American, I think he's also native Japanese.
Oh, Hikaru Nakamura.
Yeah, right. Yeah, my husband's hooked on him, so that's why I know about that guy.
It's like, it's become like this super sport, It's like, it's the same vibe of like basketball. Like there's the buzz and the community and the commentators. People are commentating on chess games. You're like, what is happening?
Right, exactly. And in a way, why not? Why not? I mean, why shouldn't chess be popularized in that way? But the point really is just for people to recognize that, it's become a drug. It is the equivalent of smoking pot or, masturbating to pornography. It's really all quite similar.
Yeah, and I like that because it destigmatizes all addictions, because it's really the same thing happening in your brain. And I know that, this is kind of contradictory what I said earlier. Like in the example of heroin, the reward is magnitudinally, infinitely greater than if you were, say, playing a chess game, and that in itself brings its own challenges. But fundamentally,
okay, wait a minute. I want to challenge that a little bit, because I don't think that's necessarily true.
Yeah, please, let's go.
So first of all, for people for whom opioids like heroin are reinforcing, in the beginning, it's rewarding, but after not a very long period of time, all you're trying to do is just get back to a level balance and stave off the withdrawal. But the other thing too is there's this whole concept of drug of choice, right? And what tips your balance to the side of pleasure may not tip my balance. And that's very, very real. I mean, there are many people for whom opioids are not at all reinforcing or even pain relieving, right? Whereas playing a video game or watching pornography or reading a romance novel might be transportative. And if you think about it from a population level, it makes sense, right? You wouldn't want everybody in the population to be like going for the same reward. If you think about, again, primitive societies, you would want some people to be really into like grain, and other people to be really into berries, right? And other people to really like meat.
Yeah.
Because that sort of then, that sort of distributes, let's say, the chances of survival. And so that's a very real thing. And I think this drug of choice, or the inter-individual variability, which is very relevant to our current world, because, 2-3 generations ago, there really weren't that many options. And if you weren't particularly rewarded by, let's say, alcohol, caffeine, or nicotine, you probably weren't going to be exposed to a drug that really tipped your balance. But now that's not true. Right now, there's like an infinite variety, and there's incredible access. So now we're all vulnerable.
Yeah, and I love there's a phrase you have in the book where it's your drug of choice is coming to a website near you soon if it's not already, and that's just glorious. And I really appreciate you jumping in there, because you actually have explained something that I haven't been able to crack my whole life. So I grew up in Ireland. Like stereotypically and traditionally, we have quite a big issue with alcohol. And so I was surrounded by an environment where lots of people from a young age, my peers, would have really got sucked into this. And for some reason, it just didn't do it for me. Like, it was never my drug of choice. And I could never understand, why would this affect somebody else? Even though I know, and I would kind of classify myself as someone who has an addictive personality in many other domains in life. And I really kind of would say that my drug of choice is like the fantasy world. So this idea of, I know a lot of addictions have escapism to it, but for me, it's going to somewhere else in my head.
Yes.
And that's really interesting. And I think you can probably relate to that as well.
Yes, that's my drug too. It has been from a very early age. I would bring books to the dinner table, anything to sort of not be in the current reality and to escape to some other reality. That's right.
Oh, I forgot to mention earlier. You'll love this. You ever heard of the sci-fi writer H.G. Wells? War the World. He has this great quote online, and I found it I found it last year when I was getting off chess, and it says something like, "If you want to destroy a man, get him into chess." Or it's like for your enemies, if you want to absolutely like unhinge your enemies, just get them really, really into playing chess, because they'll not want to do anything else. And I was like, dude, here's this Victorian writer who he knew what was going on like way back then.
Right.
And you talk about bringing a book to the table. Parents around the world today would cry tears of joy if their kids were bringing books to the table. Yet, the drug is so much more stronger because it comes in a smartphone kind of hyper fast connective
That's
way.
Right. That's right.
I really want to talk about this idea of the real world versus the fantasy world, because something that you sort of prescribe in the book is this idea of a dopamine fast. And I will give some time to kind of go into what that is. But I have, since reading the book, I did the month, and then I enjoyed the month so much that I did another month. And now I'm probably on month 3 of a relatively restrictive dopamine lifestyle. And I have to say, this is a tool that I wish I had have known about, say, 10 years ago. And I think the reason why I'm such a big fan of the Seesaw is, in my everyday life now, if I feel that kind of, what's the best way to say it? Like the desire to use, like that pang, and it could be to use anything. It could be to have a bit of chocolate, or to stick some music on, or to, I don't know, let's say play chess or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I have a framework now, and I have some language that tells me, oh, okay, like your seesaw is slightly out of balance here.
Yeah.
And the way you can regulate this is by doing the complete opposite. So,
yes.
And it's talk to me about the paradox of, and again, this is like every religion on the planet seems to have got to this place where they've concluded that the way up is down and the way down is up. It's just so crazy to me.
Yes. Oh gosh, I love hearing you say that, because that you have captured exactly what Dopamine Nation is about and why I wrote it. because this is a discovery, that I also made in my life, and it's very, very powerful. And it's this idea that, if you are unhappy in your life, or if you are in distress, or if you are craving, the thing to do is paradoxically not to reach for that feel good instant comfort, but instead to do something that is hard. And that's really tricky, because in the moment it just feels so incredibly wrong.
Yeah.
Right? It just feels like, wait, and yet you're absolutely right. It's this awareness that pleasure and pain are relative, and that when we are not at peace in this regard, we have something out of balance. And the way to bring it back into balance is actually to press a little bit on that pain side, which then tells our body, oh, wait a minute, we need to upregulate our own restorative, healing, re-regulating mechanisms. For example, we need to make more dopamine or more serotonin or more norepinephrine or whatever it is, which is why part of our daily practices really needs to be, embracing a form of asceticism, in doing things, in practice every day that are hard to do, right? Things that once we start to do them, we're looking forward to them being over, as opposed to the opposite, that thing that we start and we wish it would never end. But it's precisely by doing those hard things that we reset our balance, and then either during, because it can come during the hard thing, or after the hard thing, we get some repose, some rest, some respite from our kind of chronic, dissatisfaction with life, which really is the pervasive state of being.
And it's so interesting because, I've heard you on several podcasts, and you could hear it in the host's kind of voice, the kind of quivering fear, where it's like, are you telling me that I have to live a boring life? Like, are you telling me that I have to kind of remove these intense highs? And in some ways, the answer is, well, it depends what you're after, I suppose, in your life.
Yeah.
But this idea of balance, this idea of homeostasis, and again, I don't know a lot about Buddhism, but I know enough to know that this idea of like kind of like the middle way is like really big and really important. And if I look at my own journey, if you kind of, what's the picture in my head right now? Like it's a circle, and the outside of the circle is like, the bigger the circle is, the more severe the addiction is on the peripheral edges. And, with each year that goes by, I feel like the circle's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in some ways, I've been swapping my quote-unquote more severe addictions for other things. And the closer I get to the center, the more peaceful I become, the more satisfaction I get out of my life. And as I said, in this kind of 3-month dopamine fast, and just to kind of flesh that out a little bit, like,
Please.
I have a few key things that I've done. So aside from chess, like this time last year, I wouldn't say that I am addicted to anything, but I would say that there are still coping mechanisms in my life that I turn to, as all of us have.
Yeah.
So the things that I started to restrict was I just cut sugar out.
Wow. That's not easy.
I cut alcohol because it's not that big a deal for me. And I just thought, well, this is definitely going to spike my dopamine. I can live without it for a month. And that's the thing. It's the secret of the month is you can do anything for a month.
Right.
But the other thing that I did, and this is kind of interesting to me, is a little telltale sign that I've developed over the last few years, like an artificial alarm bell as such, that would tell me how well I'm doing or how I'm feeling, is if I go for a walk, I love walking, I'm a big walker, or if I go for a drive, and I cannot do it without listening to music or listening to a podcast, I know that there is something going on that I need to address. Right. And so the third thing that I cut out was anytime I'm driving or anytime I'm walking, I have to do it without headphones or the radio. And I have to say, like, experiencing the pain of being present in those moments where, again, that desire to use, and something relatively banal like, listen to a podcast or listen to music, but just allowing yourself to kind of sit with your pain, sit with what you're feeling. The other one I did recently was I sat on my chair. We have this fire in our house, and I just kept putting logs on the fire and just sitting with it. And I don't know if it's the Anna Lembke placebo effect, but I could feel in my brain the scale tip.
Yeah,
I could feel that pain dissipate into peace. I could feel that desire fade away. And I could feel myself enjoying looking at the fire or enjoying my walk or really enjoying my commute into work. And it's just so crazy to me. Again, I've said this already, but every major religion or every 90-year-old granny that you meet is telling you to enjoy the simple pleasures of everyday life. And now you've given us a really clear scientific framework for actually, it's so true, because whenever you restrict the highs in your life, those things in the middle, those everyday things actually become so much more pleasurable and satisfying, which is mind-blowing.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So it feels, the framework feels like, why would I want to deprive myself of these pleasures? These are things I enjoy. My life would be impoverished without these pleasures. But really what you're doing is you're getting more pleasure through indirectly, right? And as you precisely as you described, these more modest, everyday, simpler pleasures become more pleasurable when we take out these highly potent, highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And it takes a while to get there. I mean, you also described that too. Like initially it's very uncomfortable, right? That's our pleasure pain balance suddenly going to the side of pain when we remove that high potent reward. But if we can just wait long enough, those gremlins will hop off. We will start to upregulate our own dopamine. And yes, then just walking along without listening to anything, just looking at our surroundings, all of a sudden is joyful again. And here's the thing. It's also a way to experience pleasure and simpler rewards and also feel more connected to ourselves, our environment, and the present moment. And I think this is really, really important because we are, especially in this modern age, constantly distracting ourselves from ourselves in the present moment and the environment around us. And that can lead to very strange feelings of not being real, often called depersonalization or derealization, this feeling of like living in the matrix, being disconnected. Maybe I'm not real. And that is a really scary, depressing and anxiety-provoking feeling. I think we all want to feel tethered, somehow tethered to the earth, to our experience, to the lives that we've been given, to our bodies. And the way to do that is, in fact, to cut out all of these external sources of dopamine and to tolerate the distress that comes with that initially, and then experience this kind of grounding effect where we slowly kind of settle into our bodies and begin to connect with ourselves and the environment. And it does come with this feeling of incredible sort of restfulness and peace and kind of a slowing down, freedom from that anxiety, which I think is so powerful and what we all really crave at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And you really see this kind of play out in a lot of recent trends in Ireland anyway. Things like people really getting into cold water exposure, which obviously ticks your box of pain. That's a form of controlled pain that we can expose ourselves to really every day with a shower, or if you're extreme with some sort of a cold plunge, even cold water on your face. That is a little bit of pain we can easily sneak into our daily routine. It won't hurt us, and it's indeed very good for us. But this idea of, being connected to nature and you're in the sea, or, I know people who are really into like barefoot walking, and it's just this kind of, I love the word tethering that you used. And it is interesting that there's definitely a craving in society for that. One question that I did have for you, and this is probably a question that doesn't have an answer. I've always been curious about why does it seem that a huge percentage of recovered addicts or recovering addicts turn to religion? Because it's a phenomenon that I haven't really been able to wrap my head around. We were looking to do a series recently to interview people who have recovered from addiction, and it was very, very hard to find somebody who faith and spirituality was not a big part of their recovery experience. Any thoughts on that or guesses of?
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts. So many thoughts on that. There's so much to say about that, and it's something that I'm very, very interested in. Well, first of all, there is there has been this hypothesis out there for a long time, since at least Bill Wilson, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, communicated to Carl Jung, the famous European psychoanalyst, about his addiction. And Carl Jung wrote back that he essentially thought that the cause of addiction was the absence of spirituality, the need for God, and not fulfilling that need is what leads to addiction. This was Carl Jung's theory. And Bill W., I think, embraced this. And as you know, Alcoholics Anonymous, although nominally a secular organization, its philosophy is really founded on this idea that a spiritual transformation is necessary to get into recovery. And at the core of that spiritual transformation is giving up this locus of control to a power outside of yourself. It doesn't have to be, the classic deity that we think of when that we use that word God. It can just be the fellowship or even the doorknob, but it just can't be you. And I think there's, tremendous wisdom in that. In terms of, what's happening on like a neurological level, I don't really know, and I don't think anybody does, but I think an interesting way to speculate about this is that, of course, those very old emotional parts of our brain, including the pleasure-pain pathway, where this balance sits, the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, all of that communicates with the prefrontal cortex, which is that gray matter area right behind our foreheads. And in fact, the reward pathway is thought to consist of the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and this prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex is a really sophisticated and very human part of, a brain. It's the part that's involved in storytelling, in delayed gratification, in future planning. And it's often considered sort of the brakes of the brain. If you consider the reward pathway, the accelerator, then the prefrontal cortex is the brakes. So I think there's a way in which, turning over that locus of control to a power outside of yourself and relying on that power really does activate the prefrontal cortex and probably other parts of the cortex that make it possible for people to then regulate that pleasure-pain balance in a way that is really essential. Because what happens when we're caught in our addiction is that the reflexive nature of that pleasure-pain balance takes over. In other words, the gremlins win and we don't get any say in what we do. But at some point, obviously, we are able to choose to change our behavior. And part of what can enable that ability to choose, I think, is this shift in perspective that's afforded by a spiritual transformation and that giving control over to something outside of ourselves, which is probably activating key cortical structures that allow us to then regulate that pleasure-pain balance in a way that we're not able to without that cortical activation.
So interesting. And that idea of giving over, I thought, was particularly interesting. I think I've shared this before on the podcast, or maybe even really anywhere. When we were 15 or 16, I was so fortunate to very shyly and very cautiously start to build a bit of a community of other guys, specifically my age, who also found themselves addicted to pornography.
Oh, good for you.
And we were involved in quite a religious culture at the time, and there's a lot of taboo going on, and we kind of sheepishly started raising the issue with our best friends. And it's really interesting because what started to happen was, looking back now, we accidentally kind of started a Porn Addicts Anonymous group.
Yeah.
And we didn't know anything about AA. We didn't know anything about recovery or accountability or the importance of sharing and opening up with people. But we got there ourselves,
Yes,
something
amazing.
intuitively inside of us knew that we couldn't do it alone and that we needed to do it together. And, it needed to be outside of ourselves. And we did kind of give a lot over to the community or to the tribe in different language. And so I can see where you're coming from with this idea of a higher power, how it can kind of play in there. So I want to be respectful of your time, and I also want to close some of the loops that I know I've kept open. The listeners are going to be like, please go back and do what you've said you will do. So I would love to hear a little bit about the dopamine fast, and I am going to kind of have an open call or an open challenge to the people listening to kind of take part in a 30-day dopamine fast if it's something that they think they're interested in. And so here's an opportunity for you to basically convince us why we should do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, so the 30-day fast, the idea there is that, you know, you can do anything for 30 days, right? It's not, we're not asking for a lifetime. And what the 30-day dopamine fast does, it's essentially an experiment. Even if you're not sure if you're addicted to or compulsively overconsuming a substance or behavior, it's an opportunity to find out if you are, or even just find out what the impact of that substance or behavior is on your life. Because when we're using a highly reinforcing drug and behavior, it's very difficult to see true cause and effect. The world is very sensory rich, but causal poor, and we are especially poor judges of the impact of quick dopamine on our lives. So the idea is to stop your drug or behavior of choice for 30 days. Number one, again, that resets reward pathways, lets those neuroadaptation gremlins hop off the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis is restored and we're better able to enjoy more modest rewards. And then again, gives us that perspective and insight to see true cause and effect. And then once we've done that, we're able to really, you know, make an informed decision about whether we want to continue to abstain for longer or go back to using that drug. And in my experience with my patients, they almost universally want to go back to using eventually, but they want to use differently. They want to use less. And now they have the awareness and let's say a healthier pleasure pain balance to try to reintegrate that substance back into their lives in a healthier way. And one of the things that I think is important to emphasize that we sort of touched on is that this is really a dynamic state. It's really us on a teeter-totter on a ball, right? Where we're constantly having to move and readjust in order to keep our pleasure pain balance supple and healthy and stay on, right? And not fall off to one side or the other. And so it's just a constant, experimenting with this, experimenting with that, and kind of narrowing down, okay, what works for me? Because what works for one person, may not work for another person. And it's a lifelong challenge, but it's really, really worth doing for all the reasons that you talked about, how ultimately it does bring us to a better, calmer, more peaceful place in our lives if we're not constantly chasing dopamine.
Yeah, you hear the term getting high on life thrown around quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I was joking with a friend a couple of months ago after the end of my first month, maybe it was even only kind of 2 weeks into the dopamine fast. I went to the spin class. And, as someone who had avoided, even just something simple like music for a while, like I came out of the spin class and I felt like I was high as a kite, because it was like the bumping music and you're exercising intensely and you're with other people. It was bordering like a spiritual experience. I was like, whoa, like you enjoy your life so much more whenever you kind of restrict some of those highs. A bit of a random question. I don't know if we can get into it, but something I am curious about is sugar. So like I said, sugar was something that I intentionally kind of cut out. It was one of my last remaining conscious coping mechanisms that I kind of keep circling the drain with. And I've found that really cleaning up my diet has, don't want to say completely removed the desire to use any drug of choice, but I feel like I'm walking around with like an extra, I don't know, like suit of armor or like a force field around me. And I just wonder, in recovery programs, whether it's something like Alcoholics or even video games, does restricting other sources of dopamine spikes help you kind of stay on the straight and narrow path, as it were?
Absolutely. And this is such an important thing. And I will tell my patients this. And there's a little bit of data to support it, but my clinical experience definitely supports this, that when we're trying to stop using a particular drug or behavior, we are much more likely to be successful if we cut out other, high dopamine types of rewards, even if they're not what we conceptualize as our drug of choice or something that we're addicted to. So you're absolutely right. In fact, when you eliminate things like sugar, from your diet, it will make it easier to stop things like alcohol or pornography or video games. Because anytime we're ingesting or engaging in a behavior that pings that reward pathway and releases dopamine, we're essentially inviting those gremlins to hop on the pain side of the balance. And really, they're indifferent to what the drug is. All drugs work on that same common pathway. They all release dopamine ultimately. So once you've got the gremlins, activated, they're going to tip that balance to the side of pain. We're going to be in a state of craving, and then we're going to want, any assortment of drugs that's available, which is precisely why this idea of, if you want to quit, one bad habit, replace one reward with another reward, I think doesn't really work. It may work for some people short term, but at the end of the day, the way to get to that place of sort of being able to find some sort of peace in this crazy dopamine overloaded world is in fact to eschew all of these highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, as you have done.
Again, you've just explained lived experience so clearly and so beautifully. Like if you kind of look at I don't know what analogy I want to use, like the slippery slope. It would always start with something so innocent, like maybe like a bar of chocolate, and then the bar of chocolate wasn't enough, and then you would go to something more extreme, and then you go to something more extreme, and then something more extreme, and then next thing you know, you're kind of full blown using your drug of choice again. So,
it happens all. It's so funny. Just the other day, my husband said, he said, well, should I get some half and half? So I, in my tea or whatever, for years I put milk in my tea, and then I progressed to half and half. And then the other day, somebody got full whipping cream for Thanksgiving. Whipped cream, and I started using that. So he's like, should I get half and half? I said, no, get cream, get the full cream.
but this is what I love about something you say in the book is that, the idea of the middle way, like we have no problem with the pleasure side of life, and we need to actively go out of our way to pursue pain. Like the thought that pain will just kind of naturally be part of my day. It's not enough, because the tidal wave of pleasure and dopamine is so great that to try to counterbalance that, we do have to actively seek it out. And we didn't have time to cover it today, but the big ones that you mentioned in the book are things like exercise. We've talked about things like cold water. I guess if I was just to ask something specific from you, is what is kind of like the most important thing on your pain schedule that you use to try to balance yourself out?
Well, for me, it's definitely exercise. So that's the first thing that I do in the morning before I get on any devices, before I eat. I go out and push my body in some sort of way, and it's really absolutely mandatory for me. It's like a sanity preserving measure. And then I do intermittent fasting with food, using kind of the 8-16 model. And I try to do intermittent fasting with digital devices. And so what I try to do is consolidate my device use to discrete hours in the day and not use outside of those hours. It's very difficult, but I try hard to do that, as well as taking some device-free vacations. So either a 24-hour period within a given week, or, a week at a time, where we go away as a family. So those are some of my sort of regular practices. Is that what you asked me? I wasn't quite sure.
Absolutely. It's really great. And again, it's so funny. We all get there in different ways. One of the ways I restricted the circle I was talking about earlier was, I got a dumb phone. So, and I restrict my smartphone use to kind of specific hours of the day, usually related to business. We spend a lot of time off the grid, as it were, as a family, and a lot of people in our kind of inner circle would do the same. And it's being intentional. Even time is a great thing. Seventh-day Adventists, I think they refer to the Sabbath as a sanctuary in time. And this idea of a 24-hour every single week switch off, I think is essential, even to rest and restore, but then also kind of, every Saturday now we have kind of one of those 24-hour periods, and you're sitting looking at ducks with your daughter, and you're like, okay, this is it. This is us for the next hour.
That's
and it actually feels really, really good.
Yeah, right. I love that. And so important for parenting. I mean, we only glancingly talked about parenting, but I really urge parents to do this, your kids should not have their own devices. They should have very limited screen time. And we need to model what we want our kids to do. So that means we have to be off of our devices too. We have to sanctify device-free times in the family. And really the way to enjoy being with small children is to make that the most exciting thing in our day, right? Because then it really is enjoyable, and they can feel that too. Kids can feel when we're with them and present, and when we really wish we were somewhere else.
And this is the last thing that I will say. What your work has helped me do is, I can't believe I didn't say this earlier in the conversation. It's just kind of, it's come to me of like how I could verbalize this. I feel like for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting to do something.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? Where it's like
I do.
That constant itch in your brain where it's like you having dinner with your family, something incredible that you love, but just like, oh, I can't wait to get back to X.
Right.
And X could be anything. It could be checking your email. It could be going to play this. It could be going to do that. And I've just felt that, like, through this dopamine fast experience, I felt that slowly start to fade away. And, you know, you talk about being in the moment, you talk about mindfulness. It has all become a lot easier whenever I've worked on the dopamine seesaw that you have so eloquently and so succinctly put together in your work. And I'm a big believer. You know, I love the hero's journey. You mentioned Odysseus in your book and the sirens, which I loved. But one of my favorite quotes is this idea that free people. And I just would love to thank you for your work that you've invested, you know, your professional career into, whether it's with your clients and now with the wider world with this book. And I'm so thankful. I kept making note after note in the margin of the book. I'm so thankful for your honesty. And I'm so grateful that you, in some ways, were able to experience addiction for yourself, because I think it has given you incredible insight and the ability to amplify your voice and your work in this field. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today.
Oh, gosh. Thank you so much. I'm really honored.
Dun, 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 dun. All right, Steve, hit me. Be honest with me, man. I look to you as a trusted friend and fellow podcaster to tell me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of a fangirl was I in that interview? Because I just feel like I was wetting myself the whole time I was speaking to her.
Does the scale have like a 15 on it?
Yeah,
because I'm thinking,
it has like an
yeah.
Anna Lembke dopamine seesaw skyrocket scale, because that's where I feel like I was.
It reminded me, to be honest, of when my daughter was about 13. She got invited to go see Lady Gaga in concert with her best friend. And yeah, it had a little bit of a similar vibe.
Yeah, well,
I'll be
so
honest.
a fun little caveat for you, and this is going to be a subliminal seed planting for a future episode, but this was one of the rare moments in my life that I was caffeinated. So I was in Germany visiting family over Christmas. I was in the basement doing this interview remotely, and someone had accidentally switched out my special little pot of decaf coffee for regular coffee, and I was wired to the moon. I mean, I haven't had caffeine for probably like 2 years, so I was intentionally trying to keep myself down during this interview just so I could function and get my words out.
And how perfect is that at a very meta level that you are actually under the influence of a rather powerful psychoactive stimulant?
See, I knew you would like that. I knew there was fertile ground in there for you.
I love it.
So, seriously though, like what were some of your key takeaways from this? Because there was a lot going on there, and you know, as a host and as an interviewer, you're always trying to like guide the wheelbarrow down the hill. It's like, we're moving so quickly, time's running out. I want to cover this, but I can't now. So how did it hit you? And give me some of your big things that stood out to you.
Absolutely. So, I mean, honestly, there were, I think I have like 15 things written down, but the three, I think the most important takeaways that I wanted to highlight and just shine a little spotlight on for our audience. Number one, absolutely love the image, the heuristic, really, in other words, the little mental shortcut of the seesaw of pleasure and pain in the brain. I mean, just and so here's what's really interesting is when you first had that conversation and Anna Lembke is saying, okay, you know, the brain has pleasure circuits, reward circuits, and it functions like a seesaw with pain. I found myself instantly pushing back and saying, wait. And then she dropped the other shoe, which is, look, the pain is often very subtle because it's the pain of craving. It's the pain of saying, so, you know, the image, and I think this is one she gave of just like, okay, so you have You have the bit of chocolate, you have the bite of delicious cheesecake, and you get the surge of dopaminergic, dopamine-based reward. But then immediately those reward circuits kick in and they say, do it again, let's have more.
Yes.
And we start to have the itch. We start to have the crave. It's like, okay, I must have more of this. And so we go for a repeat performance. We have another bite. And we notice, oh, that wasn't quite as intense.
The
as
diminishing
first bite.
returns of each extra square of chocolate. There's my research paper I'm going to submit to the world.
It's unbelievable. And, you'll sometimes hear addicts say, and I have heard addicts say this, that like, okay, the first time they used heroin, the first time they used crystal meth or crack was ecstatic and transcendent. And they spend the rest of their life chasing that experience.
Dude, isn't there an expression in the heroin community? Isn't it chasing the dragon or something? We are always trying to chase
exactly.
that initial high.
Exactly right. And so we all experience that pain to a less dramatic extent.
This has been something that as I've been taking the Anna Lembke Seesaw out into the wild with my friends and family, the pain is something that they've been kind of getting caught up on. Until you add in that layer, you kind of broaden out the definition of pain. And the way I found it really works, or it really lands with people as well, is it's like the first YouTube video you watch, and then it ends, and then there's that itch to like watch something else, and the recommended bar pops up, and it's like autoplay in 5, 4, 3, or you get to the end of one of your favorite Netflix shows, and it's like that autoplay, and it's timed perfectly, so you're like, I feel the pain, I know I should go to bed, but I want to watch a little bit more.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I think what Dr. Lemke has really tapped into is the paradox that when we chase pleasure, it always eludes us. It fails to deliver what we're looking for. It does deliver the very first time, but that's kind of spontaneous and serendipitous. It's like, oh, this is amazing. Let's have a repetition. Let's do it again. And so addiction can be seen as this incredibly tragic state where we're on the seesaw, we're pushing, and we never even get quite back to even again, because the brain is fighting us every step of the way. It's habituating, it's developing tolerance. And the worst of it, and we're going to really unpack this in our 101 episode on addiction, is that what really maintains addiction is more craving than pleasure.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah. And so anyway, I thought that was absolute gold. I'm really so glad that she brought up that image. And
the fact that, as you said, that you end up using just to get to a state of equilibrium. Like I did an interview recently with a former cocaine addict, and he's this really professional guy. Like he tattoos celebrities, and he's kind of like famous around the world. And he was saying, I did take cocaine just to get out of bed in the morning, just so I could be functional. And I was like, dude, and he said to me, like point blank, it's like it stopped becoming about a thrill or a pleasure or a good time, like very, very quickly.
Absolutely. Okay, fantastic. So the second thing that really jumped out, and probably to most of our audience, was the idea of a dopamine fast.
Oh, it's sticky, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wanted to bracket that actually with a little qualification, a little disclaimer, which is I am certain that what Dr. Lemke is recommending is not that we remove all sources of pleasure from our lives for an entire month, because of course dopamine is the main neurotransmitter, brain chemical that's involved in our sensation of reward and craving, for that matter. She's not saying, look, take all the pleasure out of your life for a month and see what happens. She's saying, take a mental inventory of everything that brings you pleasure, everything that brings you reward, anything that brings you a sense of well-being, and subdivide it between the things that are the empty calorie rewards, which are basically like, oh, this is fast and furious.
So you're basically like, I get a lot of pleasure and joy from taking my daughter to the park to see the ducks. That's not something I'm going to cut out on this dopamine fast. Yeah.
Not at all. No, what's so beautiful about this is our reward circuits are calibrated for the ancestral human environment, for this ancient world in which they were trying to give us a sense of deep reward and satisfaction from doing all the things that lead to flourishing in that world. So basically, we can think of everything that brings us pleasure or reward. We can view it through the lens of, is this something that is fast and furious that hits me? You know, like having this yummy bite of chocolate cheesecake. Like, it's instantaneous. It is by the way, a type of food that was never present in the ancestral environment.
What? Are you serious? Are you telling me the hunter-gatherer great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather wasn't picking chocolate cheesecake off a tree?
Don't get me started. We will someday talk about, we'll go down the rabbit hole with our audience of big food, bioengineering.
Big cheesecake. We're coming for you.
The foods that are the most addictive are the ones that have been specifically engineered to be unlike anything our brains are prepared
And that's the key word. Whenever a food company is employing food engineers, that's when you gotta start ringing a couple of alarm bells in your head, I think.
Do you have Snickers in Ireland?
Oh, dude, they are unbelievable. Not to sponsor
to me,
Snickers, but
yeah, we have by the way, no financial conflict of interest with Big Snicker, but to me, the Snicker bar is the king of all candy bars. I have loved it and craved it since I was probably 7 years old. They've been around that long. And again, it's like this trifecta of sweet, salty, savory. Oh, wait, a quadfecta.
goopy, crunchy. There's a bite to it. There's a smudge to it. How many factors can we put in here? Is there a limit?
It's like it's an octafecta or something.
There we go.
By the way, we have a word for making up words in the clinical realm. We call it neologism. And it's actually a symptom of some forms of mental illness. So I'll just leave that with you.
I'm going to be honest. I can't take you seriously because I'm not sure if that's like a little gambit you're playing where you've just made up that word on the spot.
No, it's a real thing. Look it up, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm going to have to fact check that in the show notes.
Neologism. I pronounce it neologism. And it just means basically making up new words.
I don't know. It's a little bit like 99% of facts are made up on the spot. Like it's like one of those. All
right, where was I? So the dopamine challenge, the dopamine fast. Let's think about all the things that we do that bring us that really empty calorie reward. And I know I'm using a food metaphor, but that could be playing video games. That could be using social media. That could be maybe binge watching, streaming for some of us. For some people, maybe it's pornography. For some people, it's gambling. The list is pretty vast. But the idea is if we cut those things out for some period of time, it will give our reward circuitry a chance to recalibrate, to renormalize. Now, Anna Lembke suggested 1 month. As we will talk about in great detail, your mileage, your results may vary. And frankly, I will tell you as a clinician who has worked with several really severe drug addicts, it took their dopamine circuits a year or more to fully renormalize. So we definitely don't want to in any way suggest like, 1 month and you will have a completely normal set of reward circuitry. But for those of us who have more modest addictive tendencies or more moderate, we're going to see I think some real benefit from the dopamine fast.
Yeah, the harder you go, the longer you have to kind of climb up again. You know, it's like the classic what goes up must come down. And interesting, like she really challenged me whenever I made that point on heroin versus, I don't know, was I talking about chess or video games or something? But
yeah.
But there is that kind of brain component that I think you just can't get away from. And I've heard her actually talk about in other interviews what impact different behaviors and different substances have on your dopamine system. And it was something like, chocolate doubles it, and smoking a cigarette like times it by 5. And then I think and this is just ballparking here, I can't remember the actual numbers. It was like cocaine times it by 10. And then it was something like heroin times it by 50. And I was like, oh, brother, this is next level. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that you raise. And I also think that, try it out for a month and see how it hits you. And maybe like myself, you'll go on a bit of a longer journey here. I would say I'm probably 3 or 4 months into it by this stage. And so far, I'm just going to keep going on a month-by-month basis until I'm ready to reintegrate, I guess.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Now the final point, and this is one I have to make as a licensed clinical psychologist, as a clinician, and it's like, look, there are so many people that are caught in the grip, in the vortex, in the web of addiction. And many of us, if we are caught in that web, we're not going to break free on our own. You've heard me say it before, you'll hear me say it again. We humans are we're an incredibly social species. We're designed to rely on each other. And if you are caught in the grip of addiction, there's a really good chance that the path to freedom, the path to escape, is going to go through a community and or a professional. The community could be a 12-step program. It could be another community of kindred spirits. It could be a professional. It could sometimes involve a rehab program. It could sometimes involve a hospital, especially for those who are in the grip of a substance that dramatically changes the way the body functions. So in other words, it's really not safe to withdraw from a substance like heroin or alcohol cold turkey. For some people, they really need medical supervision. So I just want to put that plug in some of our listeners' ears. If you have someone in your life, or if that someone is you, make sure that this is not a journey that they undertake by themselves.
Awesome, Steve. Ever the compassionate professional. That's why you're here. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. So I guess that is probably where we'll end the episode. Do give us some feedback. Would you be interested in hearing some more conversations? Also want to give a quick plug to our Q&A episode, which is coming up in a few weeks. We would love to get your questions for that. You can submit voice messages, preferably. There's a little widget on our website, mentalhealth.fm. You can also submit anonymously. You can also submit via email or by a little contact form on our website as well. You can also just reach out to say hello. Let us know if you're enjoying the pod. Also, would like to give a quick little plug to our Patreon community, where you can join us and support the podcast, our mission of providing free educational content to people all around the world. And I know Steve and I would really, really appreciate it. We have committed to a 6-month journey with this podcast, and we are leaving it up to you guys, leaving it up to the universe to see if our journey extends beyond that. So yeah, really appreciate that. And Steve, do you maybe want to give a quick little plug to what people can expect with Addiction 101 coming up in a few weeks, where we do the deep dive on addiction ourselves?
So how can I tell if something is really an addiction? How can I tell if it's diagnosable? How does diagnosis work? Is addiction on a spectrum, or is it like a binary kind of all or nothing thing? Do addicts ever get better on their own? Does it ever happen? And if so, how does that work?
Yeah, true. That's like the flip of what you were saying earlier. I'm interested. No, yeah, I'm falling for the clickbait. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Do all addictive substances work the same way in the brain? Or do some hit different parts of the brain? Do they work differently or all the same? Oh, I love this one. Is there such a thing as a, quote, addictive personality, end quote? What's an addictive personality?
Absolutely.
We have so much coming.
Yeah, and some of the questions that I'm hoping to bring to the table, this is unfair because I'm giving you a chance to prep. I usually like to spring things on you. I want to know, like, what is the superpower of a recovered addict? What is the superpower of someone who maybe has a vulnerability towards addiction? Is there some part of their brain that makes them useful to the community from an evolutionary perspective? And also, why the heck is addiction part of our species? Why did it not just get naturally selected out? Why is it still here? Why are our brains built like this? And that is why you're here, Steve, because you're able to speak so clearly and so beautifully to all that as well.
Yeah, listen, Hugh and I both have our roles. We both love this give and take, and we're so grateful that you all are on this journey with us.
So look, Steve has begged me at the start of this recording that he really wants to end today's episode with some nature noises. I fought him. I was like, Steve, let's just do the normal intro. And he was adamant about it. So please welcome to your ears, I don't know, like some sort of random birds or whatever royalty-free nature sounds I can dig up from the audio world.
I'm so excited.
So blame Steve for your awesome sense of calm and connectedness before you go on to whatever you're up to the rest of your day. And until next time, all the best and stay well.